back from in the teenage class, and so new material. I feel like I've been in Acts 1 through 15 for 6 months. Oh wait, I was. But I enjoy doing that, and it's a joy to come back. So for the most part this quarter, we will be looking at Paul's later letters. I know you spent a good bit of time in the last quarter looking at Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians. This quarter, we're going to do basically the rest of Paul's letters. But Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon are understood to be what have been called prison epistles or prison letters. So Paul will not have written those until what we read in Acts 28. And then 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are generally considered to be after that. 1st and 2nd Timothy. 1st Timothy probably during his imprisonment or near the end of it. Then Titus somewhere in there. And then 2nd Timothy possibly another imprisonment. That is, he's imprisoned again. And we'll talk about that when we get to there. But before we get there, we've got to get Paul to prison in Rome. And we are going to start in Acts chapter 21 tonight and make our way through. And I know you know that story, and so we won't do a lot of review because I think y'all have done that pretty recently. We'll kind of try to just pick up maybe where you've left off and make our way with Paul as he's making his way to Jerusalem. Anything you want to say as we jump in?
Not yet.
Okay, great. All right, so we come to Acts chapter 21, and maybe you've already covered verses 1 through 16. But this is kind of the outline that I'm working with as we go through Acts 21. Paul is going to Jerusalem. Remember in Acts 20, he's making his way back, and he's doing so with a little bit of haste. So he takes the time to meet with the Ephesian elders, but he's trying to make it back to Jerusalem. He is making his way there for several reasons that we can talk about as we go. And he's going to arrive in Caesarea. This is going to be in verse 8. And I want you to notice that there are some who try to keep him from going as he makes his way along the way. There are several things in chapter 21 that I think are challenging for us to wrestle with. And I think that one of those things is you have Paul who believes that he should be going to Jerusalem, and you have other brethren who the text says through the Spirit are saying bad things are waiting on him and urging him not to go. And then let me just mention this, and we'll talk about this later. In Acts 21 at the end, Paul is going to offer a sacrifice, which I think raises some questions. And I read today an article from a man who preaches for a congregation that it would be near accompanied to us. And he said that Paul was sinning all the way through chapter 21. That in going to Jerusalem, in denying the witness of the prophets that are talking to him, and offering that sacrifice, that he's making bad decisions all the way through. And that the fact Paul gets arrested was due justice to him. And he said, the last line was, I reckon he should have listened to all those warnings. Well, I think that is false. I don't think that Paul is doing something wrong in any of these circumstances, including in the sacrifice that he offers. And I think that requires a little bit of explanation. I don't know if you've read J.W. McGarvey. He had the commentary on Acts. He took the position that Paul was doing something wrong in offering that sacrifice. I think we need to wrestle with that and think about what's happening there. So as we come down, there's several things that are happening as Paul is making his way to Jerusalem. One thing that I would say here is, notice verse 14 of chapter 21. Paul would not be persuaded to not go to Jerusalem. And what do the people say? The will of the Lord be done. I don't think the people think of Paul as rejecting God's will. They think of him as doing God's will. Now, here's the question. What about what they're hearing through the Spirit that suffering's going to come? I think that's exactly right. I think the Spirit is, in fact, saying suffering is going to come. I think the Spirit is saying that that bondage is going to come. And yet Paul, recognizing that, also has the commission to go to Jerusalem, and they say, okay, we were misunderstanding what the Spirit was telling us. The Spirit was saying this is coming, but he wasn't telling you to stop. And that's what Paul is saying here as he makes his way.
It kind of reminds me of David when he was in Keilah and Saul was going after David. And, he got word from God, if you stay here, Saul will get you. But David still had the option to leave, and that's what David ended up doing. There was possible outcomes either way.
That's right. Now, there are other reasons that Paul is making his way to Jerusalem. Like, for example, he is responsible for taking that contribution to the saints in Jerusalem. And I imagine, as we saw in chapter 20, that group of men is still with him as they're making their way, serving as kind of the certifiers that contribution gets to where it's going. Anything else you want to say kind of leading up to that down in verse 16?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Any comments or questions on that through verse 16?
Sorry, I do have something to say. I changed my mind, I guess. I do want to call back to something Lonnie may mention of, and Austin as well. When we were in Romans, Paul had that prayer there, and he asked the brethren in the letter to Rome to keep him in prayers. Romans 15, he says, but now I'm going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints, talking about the collection. For it pleased those from Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints who are in Jerusalem. So that's talking about his contribution there. And then down in verse 30, now I beg you, brethren, through the Lord Jesus Christ and through the love of the Spirit, that you strive together with me in prayers to God for me. And then we talked about the four things he prayed for, that I may be delivered from those in Judea who do not believe, and that my service for Jerusalem may be acceptable to the saints, that I may come to you with joy by the will of God and may be refreshed together with you. And so those are four things Paul prayed for and asked for prayer in. And I think it's helpful to think about those things as we go and see how they play out. Lonnie may mention the fact, looking ahead, that those things are going to play out, but not exactly the way Paul probably hoped that they would. And I think we can keep those things in mind. And we'll see some of that begin and unravel tonight as we get in the text.
I think he felt some responsibility. He went around and took up this collection from these congregations as a representative to, the congregations understood that he, as well as the companions that they sent him, would be taking that money to Jerusalem. So I'm sure he felt some responsibility to fulfill that.
That's right. I agree. Yeah, and the fact that he mentions the prayer there at the end of the book of Romans and other places, I only mentioned that article about the guys. I think that's a very rare view to look at what Paul does here and see sin instead of courage. I think that's a rare view. But I just wanted you to note that there are some people, I think, who look at what Paul's doing here in all of Acts 21 as questionable. And so when we come to the sacrifice thing, I think there will be some things to talk about. But I think Mr. Gerald's exactly right that, repeat what you said one more time at the very end.
Well, I think he felt compelled to
Yes.
See this venture out, seeing how he had went around and collected that money.
Right.
Not for the needy saints. He did it under the impression that he would be delivering that money, and then if he backs out, here's less. That would.
That's right. Yeah. It's in 2 Corinthians where he's writing to them, probably chapters 8 and 9, where he talks about wanting to do everything doing good in the sight of all men, right? Like keeping everything above board in his operations, which was why he had the men with him. And I agree with you, why he felt responsible for taking the gift to them directly.
Also, Galatians 2:10, and I hope I'm not taking this out of context. The Jerusalem brethren, when Paul had visited in times past, they asked Paul to remember the poor as he goes out among the Gentiles. So this is seeming like something he's looking forward or looking to accomplish.
That's right.
But also in his previous missionary journeys, he would want to go into areas, and the text tells us the Spirit did not permit us to go, so they didn't go.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not what's happening.
That's right. So he knew where he could be. He was willing to be persuaded not to go and all that.
That's a good point.
Yeah, that's very good. Okay, so if you want to, let's go down to chapter 21 and verse. I think we're ready for verse 17. Is that right? And Collier, if you want to read, I have it as verses 17 through 26. You can read however much of that you want to, and then we'll go from there.
Perfect. And when he had come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. When he had greeted them, he told in detail those things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord. And they said to him, "You see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. But they have been informed about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. What then? The assembly must certainly meet, for they will hear that you have come. Therefore, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things of which they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. But concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided that they should observe no such thing, except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality." Through 16? 26. Then Paul took them in, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them.
Very good. All right. Anything you want to say about that before I start blabbering?
You can go, and
Okay.
I'll add to.
Yeah, great.
I'll follow
Okay.
your lead.
So looking at verse 17, notice when they come to Jerusalem, the brothers are glad they're there. And I want you to see there, the following day, Paul went in with us, and James and all the elders were present. I think we would have evidence that James is one of the elders there. It's interesting that it seems like a little bit of a transition occurs through the book of Acts. I don't know that I noticed this before. If some of the men went to the College View study with Russell Legrone and Marty Broadwell, they had a chart that showed at the beginning of Acts, you have lots and lots of references to the apostles. And as you go through the book of Acts, especially with regards to the church at Jerusalem, you have more and more reference to the elders as you progress through. I think that's helpful. I'm not saying that the apostles are not present in this situation, but it seems to be the elders of the church at Jerusalem that are the focus here as far as the engagement with Paul, probably because they're going to be the recipients of the gift that he is bringing, but also because, one, some of the apostles are going other places. We know that. And in addition to that, the apostles have a broader work to doing, and the elders are responsible for the church there at Jerusalem. Now, I want you to see here, how do they respond when Paul talks about the work that he's been doing in Gentile territory? What's their initial response? They glorify God, right? There is joy. So among the leadership of these, and they are Jewish Christians, right? These are Christians who are descendants of Abraham genetically, right? Biologically. They are happy that the Gentiles or the nations are responding positively to the gospel that Paul and Barnabas, Paul for the last couple of journeys have been doing. Now, when they hear it, they glorify God, and then they come up with it's a challenge, a difficulty, a speed bump. They are not opposed to Paul's work, but they say there is a misconception. There is something that is foggy in the minds of lots of the Jewish Christians. And I take that to be, I think when the elders encourage Paul to do this, they are saying to do this on the behalf of the Jewish Christians. I don't think they're saying do this necessarily on behalf of Jews in general, right? Jews in general should have been listening to the apostles. Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles, right? I'll give this answer. He's the apostle to the Gentiles. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't have some responsibility of clarifying things for the Jewish Christians. And I think that's what's happening here. So what they accuse him of is they say that some of the believing Jews, Jewish Christians, have heard that when you go and you preach in these Gentile areas, that you tell the Jews not to follow Moses, not to circumcise your children, and really to forsake all of those things, right? So they're going to hear that you have come, and we want you to go and offer a sacrifice so that they will know, notice this is the end of verse 25, that they will know that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. Verse 25, but concerning the Gentiles who have believed, and we can say more about this in a minute, they say, we know that the law doesn't apply to them. We only told them not to be involved in sexual immorality, stay away from things strangled, from blood, and from idols, right? So we know we're not imposing the law on them, but we want the Jewish people to know that you walk orderly and that you follow the law and that you're not discouraging Jews from breaking the law. And so then verse 26, Paul goes and does precisely what they ask, observing these Old Testament sacrifices in order to satisfy the Jewish people to understand that he walks orderly and follows the law. Now, I know, to me, when I first encountered this passage, it was a challenge to me because, I don't know if you're like me, but your whole life we've heard we are not under the law's been abolished, it's been taken out of the way, and there is no reason for a Christian to follow the law. And then here is Paul doing this. Let me say this, I have heard this passage used as justification for instrumental music. And here's how they did it. They said, you say we don't use instruments because they're in the old law. Here Paul is literally following an Old Testament sacrifice. Why can't we go back to the Old Testament and get the instruments, right? You see the challenge? You see the difficulty? And that was where I first wrestled with this passage. I think I have an answer. I don't know if it'll be satisfying to you, but I think it's satisfying to me. But the reason for that is why I can understand a brother saying, I think Paul made a mistake. Or why I could understand J.W. McGarvey, who was a great Bible student, writing his commentary, that this was an unwise move by Paul. But I don't think that's the case. So here's what I think is happening. Let me get my pencil. What I think is happening is that we need to understand the difference in a Jewish person called to be a Christian and then trying to impose the law of Moses onto Gentiles. I take it to be that Paul was not in opposition to Jews continuing to practice basically what we would read in the Old Testament, including the Sabbath and meat laws, and even in this case, some of the sacrifices. I would suggest that there probably were some limitations to that, given that the sacrifices that were for sin have been fulfilled in Christ. But in this particular case, this seems to be a sacrifice that's connected to a vow, maybe something like a Nazirite vow that has been made. And it seems to me that Paul was never insistent on Jews leaving the law behind. All right? Now, what he would say is, you think you're following the law, but if you don't follow Christ, you've missed the law, right? You think you're following it, but if you don't see where it's pointing, you who claim to be law followers have actually broken the law in the worst way possible because you didn't see where it was all headed. Let me also say this. Paul would never suggest that the law was sufficient in and of itself, right? He would say that the law did not reveal the righteousness of God. It was just pointing to it, right? It was just a testifier to the righteousness of God. But now in Christ Jesus, sins can be taken care of in a full way. I know I'm talking a lot. Just give me 1 second. Okay?
You're fine. Yeah.
Now,
Keep going.
on the other hand, Paul was absolutely opposed to doing anything that would put a Gentile under 1 inch of the law, right? So whether it's circumcision, whether it's abstaining from certain meats, whether it's keeping the Sabbath day, he was opposed to making Gentiles follow the law. I believe that Paul did basically, if we could say it this way, maintain his faithfulness to the law. I think it raises a little bit of a question, a passage like 1 Corinthians 9, where he says to the Jews, well, this is 1 Corinthians 7, excuse me, to the Jews I became a Jew, to the Gentiles I became a Gentile, so that by all means I might save some. It seems as though he kind of adapted to the audience that he was a part of. But I think the fact that Paul goes through this is an indicator that he was willing to put himself under obligations to the law if it would help bring Jews to Christ. All right. Now we know Jews did not have to keep the food laws anymore. Acts chapter 10, I think, should be definitive about that. That Peter is told to rise, kill, and eat. Right? If that's not clearing them of the Old Testament laws, I don't know what is. But I don't think that there was any reason why they had to stop following the law if they're Jews. I don't think they had to stop circumcising their sons. I don't think they had to stop keeping the Sabbath. I don't think they had to stop observing the food laws. They had to see Christ if they were going to be saved. Now, let me give you one illustration of this that I think helped me the most. I think Stephen Russell shared this with me when I was working. This has been 12 years ago when I had these questions, and I reached out to him and Gardner Hall and other people trying to figure out answers. This was his illustration I thought was helpful. Do you remember Timothy and Titus? What does Paul do? What does Paul have done? I don't know if he was the one who carried it out. What does Paul have done to Timothy when he calls him to preach with him? He has him circumcised. Do you remember why? Timothy's mother was a Jew, right? His father was not. We don't know anything really about his father's status, but his father was not, and he had not been circumcised. But the idea of a Jewish boy not having been circumcised was going to be a roadblock in getting Jewish people to listen to his message, right? Paul was willing to observe Jewish things for Jewish people in order to bring Jewish people to Christ. On the other hand, you remember Titus? Galatians chapter 2, Collier quoted just a second ago. When it came to him being circumcised, what does Paul say? We didn't give in to them even for a minute. Now, Titus is in a different situation. His mother and father were both Greeks, and Paul would not let him be circumcised. Because to take a Gentile and put him back under the law, I think Paul would say, that may be a roadblock to some Jews, but it's not a roadblock I'm willing to tear down because I'm not letting you put Gentiles under the law. All right, does that make sense? Okay, so I think that's what Paul's doing here. I think he is observing this sacrifice because I think he sees that it's appropriate to continue under the law as a Jew in view of the fact that Christ has come. With regards to instrumental music, what I would say is that does not mean that Paul does not see the new covenant as the fulfillment of all those Old Testament pictures, and to go back and try to justify the way we do our worship in that way, I think would be short-sighted, and we can talk more about that if you'd like. The last thing that I want to say is in verse 25. If you look at the list of things that the Gentiles were supposed to do, the list of things that Gentiles were supposed to do, you would say, but isn't that imposing the law on them, right? Yes, no, okay? Leviticus 17 and 18, I think, is the passage that this is being drawn from. And in those passages, you have specific restrictions on Israel from eating things with blood, Leviticus 17 and 11, because the life is in the blood, eating things that are strangled, eating things offered to idols, or engaging in worship to idols at all. And then all of chapter 18 is about sexual immorality. Now, if you go to Acts 15, where they're trying to decide if Gentiles have to follow the law or not, they decide no. And in the letter that they send to the Gentiles, they say, you don't have to follow the law, but you do have to do these things. Here's the reason. At the end of Leviticus 18, after talking about strangling, blood, idols, and sexual immorality, Moses tells them, don't do these things because the people in the land that you are taking have been doing these things, and that's why God's bringing judgment on them. When the apostles and elders wanted to tell Gentiles that they didn't have to follow the law, they didn't want them to get the idea that everything in the law of Moses was only intended for the Jews. There were some things that had been God's eternal law and needed to be observed because it was not being observed by the people in the land of Canaan and they were being cast out. All right. So that's why those four things are listed there in verse 25. So Paul takes them, he makes the sacrifices, it's offered for him and for them, and they pay the cost for the vow. All right, Collier?
Yeah, I mean, I think the case you made, and you can reference many verses in the epistles as well, that it was appropriate for Jewish converts to keep the law, to continue keeping the law, as long as they kind of kept it in practice, and maybe culturally almost, but they recognized that we're not justified by the law any longer, that it's now in Christ that we're justified. And I don't see what Paul's doing as any kind of doctrinal compromise or going backwards. I see it the same way Larson kind of mentioned, meeting them where they're at, showing them I'm not disproving of the law. I'm not tearing down everything that was built before this. It's still appropriate to practice this law, and kind of letting them know. So like Larson said, to meet them where they're at, to maybe even help them understand the gospel better, to help lead Jewish to Christ. I think that was the point of what Paul was doing and the plan that the elders had.
That's right. Yes, for sure. That's right.
But the eating of blood, God tells no one not to do that.
That's right.
Yes.
That predates.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. And I think we would say that about other things as well. I think we would say sexual immorality would. I think when Jesus is asked about sexual immorality, he doesn't go to Deuteronomy 24 about divorce. He goes to Genesis 2, right, and says I think we would say the same thing about murder with Genesis 9 and Genesis 4. So I think you're right. There are things that predate that. The reason I think these things are specifically stated is because they are so explicitly mentioned in like the book of Leviticus. And you're like, what's more law of Moses applying to Jews than the book of Leviticus, right? That's as much as it gets. And I think they were saying there's specific things in that were applied to the people in the land as well. One way that's helpful to me is lots of times people say that Jesus and the apostles did not address modern sexual deviancies because they just used the word fornication. Leviticus 18 is the definition, is the dictionary that they're using for the word fornication. You can read through Leviticus 18 if you'd like to on your own time, and you will see that it describes the regulations there regarding sexual immorality. And the reason that's significant is when Jesus uses the word don't commit fornication or don't commit sexual immorality, that's the catalog of the things that are included. And that would include the things that our time says Jesus never spoke about. He did. He just used one word to summarize what's going on in Leviticus 18 that we see here being applied to Gentiles, not just the Jews. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments? That takes us all the way down through verse 26. I know that was a lot just on that section.
It says walk orderly and keep the law. And he's doing everything he can here, really, that should avoid the trouble comes in the next few verses.
Yes.
They make an assumption.
For sure.
There. So he's just trying to, as it says, walk orderly there and not give them reason to cause trouble. Of course, he wouldn't be able to enter the temple if he doesn't purify himself, even though he doesn't have to.
That's right.
The law, but now he can.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
That's a good point. And it really speaks to the attitude that the Judean Jews and Jews from Asia are going to have towards him. When he's doing all these things, walking in order as he should.
Yes, and let me say this. I think we will see that throughout his interaction with the Jews is several things I think that will indicate to us that the way he approaches them is different than he has approached the Gentiles in other places. Not that he's contradicting himself, but he just has a different approach. And I'll try to highlight those as we go so that we can see them, because I think we'll see them in chapter 22. Okay. Any other questions, comments?
You just take us to the end of the chapter?
Yes, if you want to, that'd be great.
All right. Speaking up in verse 27. Now, when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help. This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was disturbed, and the people ran together, seized Paul, and dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. Now as they were seeking to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. He immediately took soldiers and centurions, and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came near and took him, and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains. And he asked who he was and what he had done. And some among the multitude cried one thing, and some another. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. When he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, "Away with him." Then as Paul was about to be led into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" He replied, "Can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" But Paul said, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people." So when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language. Well, I maybe should have stopped at 39. 40 is kind of a weird transition into the next chapter. But all right, so in verse 27, Paul is seemingly going about the vow business and committing these sacrifices. Where is he at? Where are they doing this at? In the temple. And that's important because these Jews are going to see Paul in the temple. Now, specifically, where does it say the Jews are from? Jews from Asia. Would Paul have ever had any encounters with these, potentially encounters with these Jews from Asia before? Yeah, quite a few encounters. And he would have had many encounters with the people from Asia. You can think about Ephesus, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe. Those are just some places I can think of that Paul has been in his missionary journeys. He may have encountered these Jews. So I think these are different than the believing Jews that were in question at the start of the chapter that the elders had concern for. Now, why would the Jews from Asia have been there? Yeah, for Pentecost or for the feasts at the temple. And so here they are, they're observing this feast, and then here comes Paul. This is a guy they already have a strong disdain for, and it kind of stirs them up very emotionally. Verse 28, they cry out against Paul to the city, against him, and they cause kind of a great uproar. Now, what accusations do they pose against Paul? Brought a Gentile into the temple. Is that true? It's not true. It's seemingly accusations, and it's just something they put forth based on their own kind of prejudice towards Paul. They just see Trophimus with him in the city, and they just kind of make up this accusation out of their emotion and their prejudice they have towards Paul, and so it paints Paul in a bad light. Now, it's interesting. They don't really give Paul time to vouch for himself. They don't give him a chance to defend himself. Paul doesn't get to say, "No, he wasn't with me in the temple." They just kind of are stirred up, and they kind of attack Paul. Verse 31 even says they were going as far to do what to Paul? They were going to kill Paul. Now, you might say, based on what right did they have to do this? Was this just pure emotion? I did find some historical things, and again, this is not scriptural, just historical. But Josephus recorded that there was an inscription that separated parts of the temple that Gentiles could and could not enter, and it said in his writings, forbade any foreigner to go in under pain of death. I read in 1871, there was an archaeological dig. They found a stone about 50 meters from the temple site with the inscription that read, and translated modern language, "No foreigner is to enter within the balustrade and enclosure around the temple area. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his death, which will follow." So maybe there was that going on, and in their minds some justification. But regardless, you see that the Jews are acting very emotional. This is a very emotional response they have towards Paul, and it creates an uproar. Whose attention does it catch, this uproar? The Romans. Yeah, so the commander of this area, it catches their attention. Now, thinking about the climate of this time of day, how do the Romans feel about uproars? Not very good, because uproars led to potential uprisings. Is that something that the Roman soldiers definitely wanted to avoid? So naturally, the commander is going to send a group of soldiers and centurions to break up all this fuss, which they do break it up, but they're going to bind Paul with chains. They're going to try to figure out what's going on here. And so the commander is going to ask the people first. He's going to ask the crowd, kind of what the issue is with Paul and what he's done. Verse 34, and some among the multitude cried one thing and some another. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. I think you see kind of what's going on. This is really just a few people, I think, who made some accusations and stirred up the whole city. And now people don't even, and maybe people don't even realize what they're angry about. They just recognize, oh, this is somebody we're against. They may not have the actual cause down pat. They don't even have their story straight. some are suggesting one thing, some are suggesting another. And you can see that it's probably just accusations by the fact that truth is not clearly ascertained. There's not something that the commander can grab onto and say, this seems to be a realistic accusation. So they're going to take him into the barracks after this. And they couldn't get the story straight. And so I imagine the Roman officials, kind of knew about the religion at this time, but maybe they were separated from probably what was really going on and having a full understanding between Paul and the Jews. And so in verses 35 and 36, how are the people acting as Paul's carried away? Very violent. Amanda, what were you saying? Yeah, very violent. So much so the soldiers literally have to carrying him into the barracks upstairs, acting almost as a shield, and all the people are crying out, away with him. This is not just a simple accusation, that there seems to be a very violent attitude going on about this. Now, when Paul goes into the barracks, he requests to speak to the commander. And the commander seems to be just a little surprised by this, and he still doesn't really even know who Paul is. He says, can you speak Greek? And he seems to think Paul is somebody completely different, an Egyptian who started up a rebellion and led 4,000 assassins into the wilderness. I read that that's kind of mentioned in Acts chapter 6, something about that kind of uprising. And so they don't have any idea who Paul is yet. But Paul does provide the commander with some clarity about who he is. There's two things Paul says about himself. What are those two things? He's a Jew and he's from Tarsus. He's a citizen. So that's two very, very crucial pieces of information. And he has to speak with the people. And with this newfound information, the commander is going to let him. He's going to permit him to speak to the people in light of what he's learned. Larson, do you have anything to add before we jump any further?
Just to make mention, Mr. Charles said, I think it's interesting that Paul is doing this with the particular intention of easing tensions, right? And again, I think you made mention as well, they're not seeing that, right? They are immediately looking through their eyes of looking with hostility at Paul, and that's how it's going to break out. But no, I don't have anything other than that. Anybody else have anything before we come? Yes, sir. Yeah. Perhaps. I assume they are there for Pentecost, right? Which is why Paul is trying to be there. But I also think that it is possible that they are more hostile to Paul because of the success among the Gentiles that he's had. We've already read about that, in the book of Romans, for example, that the Jews on the whole had rejected the message, right? So I realized there were Christians in Jerusalem and Judea, and not a few Christians. But in comparison, it seems, with the effect that Paul is having in the Gentile world, I think the Jewish Asians, the Asian Jews, the Jewish Asians, I don't know how to say it. Of course, we're talking about Asia Minor and not Chinese people. But all that is to say is we are looking at people who are much more bothered by Paul, who have pursued him all over the Mediterranean trying to silence him. And now they see him here. And then, of course, they assume the worst.
He was a
Roman citizen, yes.
So he doesn't mention that, or is it when he says he's from Tarsus? Does that mean?
Well, at the end of verse 39, he says, a citizen of no insignificant city.
Right.
Okay. So let me say this. This part here, they do not realize that he is actually a Roman citizen. They're just saying he's just saying I'm a citizen of this city. It will not be at the end of 22, they will want to beat him. And that's when he'll say, would you do that to a Roman citizen? And so it'll take a minute for that to get clarified. Maybe that's what Paul means here. And they didn't. That's right. That's right. He's just saying he's from Cilicia.
Right. This is who I am. Yeah.
I guess he's a Roman citizen because he was born in.
Oh, that's a good question. Tarsus was not a city where that would happen. So there are several ways it could have happened. It could have happened because it's bequeathed in some way by Caesar for something that Paul's father, grandfather, ancestors had done. It could be purchased, but Paul says he was born with his. So we don't know. So like if you were born in the city of Philippi, it wasn't Rome, but you were born a Roman citizen. Right. So there were certain cities that were considered to be colonies that if you were born there, you were a Roman. Tarsus was not one of those. One thing that would happen sometimes is people would serve in the army and they would be declared citizens and then their children would inherit that. Well, that's a possibility, but Jews, I think, were a little bit disinclined to serve in the Roman army. So we don't really know exactly how it happened, but that it could have been several different ways, I think.
I don't want to take up too much time at this point, but I can't help but think about parallels between Paul and somebody else, right? Between Paul and Christ in this kind of situation. The accusations that are made, the Jew uprisings, the kind of violence that's thrown towards them, the Roman government's involvement in this, and their kind of confusion trying to figure it out, even though Paul is seemingly innocent in this based on accusations like Christ was. I think you can think back to verses, things that Jesus said. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecute me, they will persecute you. You know, Jesus knew this was something that was going to happen. And here's an example of that playing out. You see Jesus' wisdom, even before his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, he knew this was to come. And I think Paul is a good example of faithfulness, that he made this trip to Jerusalem, knowing that this was probably a wait for him. And that even in the face of these things, he remained faithful. That's why later he can say, imitate me as I imitate Christ. It's because he kind of lives up to Christ's example as best he can. I also think it shows us that Christianity is not always easy. Doing the right thing is not always easy. Here's a faithful apostle doing everything he can to be faithful and to be peaceable, but yet this is what he has to face. And so there's a few lessons I think we can learn in there regarding that.
Lars, do you think it's interesting? And I may miss it somewhere. Nobody speaks up for him.
Right. Yeah.
Even when he's talking to the elders.
Yes.
And they say what is accused of. It would be like somebody saying, coming to me and saying, Larson is teaching something wrong.
Yeah. Okay, let me ask this.
I've never heard that.
Are you talking about when he talks to the elders, like of the congregation in verse 27, or and following? I mean, back up in like verses, back in verse 20. Yeah. So, okay, that's a good question. One thing I would say is I don't think that the elders believe he is teaching anything wrong, right? Like as far as the elders of the church at Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But I'm saying when the accusation took place, they say you're teaching something at home.
Yeah.
Or somebody not there that could have said, I've never heard him.
Yeah, so in verse 21 it says, they have been told about you that you are. I think you're right. Thank you, Mr. Cole. I think you're right that somebody could have been maybe more assertive than that. I take it to be that they are defending him. I think that James and the other elders would have defended him and said, no, we're on the same page. So so I think about like Galatians 2, where he says, I went, we evaluated it. There was nothing lacking. All they asked me to do was to make sure I remember the poor, right? Like he actually has a meeting with them to verify they're on the same page. What I guess it seems to me that it was so difficult in some of these cases to see the distinctions that Paul was drawing, that Jews thought when they heard Paul telling people they didn't have to follow the law of Moses, they thought, well, there goes everything we've ever believed, right? And what Paul is saying is that the law of Moses was always pointing to Christ and never intended for Gentiles. And oftentimes that got, it's like playing the game of telephone. That got interpreted as the law is not important as the gospel, right? And that reframed everything. So all that is to say is, let me think. So I think you're right. The believing Christians should have said, Paul would not be saying those kinds of things. Paul is doing just what he's supposed to do. He's telling Jews to do what they need to do and Gentiles what they need to do. But we have had experience with people who we knew ought to know better, who didn't know better, right? And here's a case where he is asked to go and make this clarification. With regards to the other Jewish people, I would say, yes, I wish somebody would have stood up with him. I think we will see that in chapter 23, kind of, but it'll take us a minute to get there. You're right. I think, because like in the life of Jesus, for example, Joseph of Arimathea is in the Sanhedrin, and when Jesus is being accused, what does he say? Well, we don't accuse a person without evidence, right? But I take it to be that the Sanhedrin followers or the Sanhedrin members that had that kind of honest heart, I take it to be that they became Christians. They probably are not sitting on the Sanhedrin anymore. And so now you're dealing with a lot of people who have rejected Christ. And I think we'll see more of that as we go through chapter 22. That's a great question, though.
It's also not mentioned that he handed the contribution.
Oh, yes.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. I think you're exactly right. I think we'll see more of that in chapter 24.
Maybe you could tie in the glorifying God and joy part by the elders and their response.
Yes.
Maybe they recognize, oh, he's here and he's brought it. But that's I don't know. I don't want to put it into the text.
And
It
you
didn't
think
say
about
that.
that with the Jews and their response to him, that he's hostile to us. It's like, what do you mean hostile to you? Right? He's been all over the known world working to bring a gift to your people. And you're going to say he's hostile to us doing things that are against what we believe and what we hold true. So, all right. So I know it doesn't seem like we got very far. We did not get as far as I anticipated that we would. That's okay because we've got time for this. And it's just the first day of class. So we'll get plenty more behind before this is all over with. Thank you for your kind attention. If you have questions that you weren't able to make known in class, ask them of Collier, and he will be glad to respond to you as he can.
It may take the time to text Larson, but I can do it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.